Hey, how's everybody going? How's everybody doing? Yeah, so my talk is about composing music for cartoons, and I'm just gonna put myself in picture here. So the subtitle is "The Romance and the Reality of Creating Music for a Living." It's sort of a weird job. I've been in this for almost 20 years. I've worked in all sectors of audio post-production, so television, films, programming synthesizers, mixing. But my favorite joy is writing music for cartoons. And people always ask, like, what do you need to know to get into this kind of thing? So I just thought I'd list out my sort of soft skills. So um, piano lessons until I was 14, and then I quit. I played keyboards in a band, and I stayed late after school in the music lab playing with various synthesizers on their computers because I didn't have that stuff at home. Um, I played a lot of video games, and second to movies like early John Williams scores, like E.T. and Star Wars and stuff like that, video games is where I really realized, like, oh man, like music is such an amazing storytelling tool. You're playing a game and you hit the boss and the music changes or it gets faster, and all of a sudden you feel tense or you're nervous or you're anxious. Like those are all sort of mechanics of music in helping tell a story. And that's what cartoon music is all about. It's about supporting a story. Um, I also went to college for music engineering, so I learned how to make records, using analog tape and consoles. Um, I'm a kid at heart. You have to laugh when you're working on this stuff. There's a lot of burp and fart jokes. So if you can't laugh at that, you probably don't want to be in cartoons, right? And obviously, I have to love music. Otherwise, what's the point? Um, but let's talk about hard skills, and this applies to anybody in this business. You have to understand how music and production work together to create a product or a result, and that's sort of instincts, like creating different combinations of instruments to create certain vibes and feels. We also have to know the technology because we want to be able to have as much time as possible to write because our deadlines are so crazy. So, it's a combination of knowing all the different software and hardware elements, the most efficient way for all those things to talk together. Um, you need solid organization and time management skills because in a given week, you might have to write 40 different pieces of music and hire players and navigate client notes and comments and technical problems and all these things. You just have to have it all plotted out in a calendar and be able to react when things change because things inevitably do, right? And then last but not least is you have to be good at client relations, and sort of like a mind reader slash translator slash therapist because audio post-production is at the end of the line. The product has already been made. They've been in the trenches the entire time. So producers and directors and stuff tend to tell us all their woes as we're writing music for them or doing their final mixes and stuff like that. So I'd say those are like the four sort of hard skills that you'd want in this kind of business. But there are no set pathways to do this kind of job. I know I started out in the trenches at an animation company editing music. I know people who are singer-songwriters who dove into it. There's no set way to get into things. So it's kind of interesting. You talk to 20 different composers, you'll get 20 different stories of how they sort of got into it. Um, my favorite quote from a client or a fellow colleague was, writing music is the easy part. Figuring out what the hell the client wants is 95% of the job. And that's so true because most clients, especially if they're not musically trained, they'll go, I need some music. And I'll be like, great, what kind of music do you want? And they're like, music. So that's not very helpful for me. So I have to sort of, dig deep, ask questions, figure out what kind of music they like, figure out what they're after. So when I think of bespoke music, there's the composing element, there's the production element, which is using different sounds and different musical styles, and then we have client relations. So I like to think the composing and the production part of it is the art, taking my musical idea, creating something interesting, using various instruments, and then production and the client relations, that's sort of like current trends. What's the flavor of the moment? What was the most popular movie last year or the most successful show? Clients usually want to jump on those kind of things and sort of hopefully follow that bandwagon. And then me and client relations, people are like, wait, you're selling your work. So are you selling out? And I'm like, well, no. Is it compromise? No. I like to think that I'm creating something interesting because I have outside client input that I never would have heard, and I just end up coming up with something I never would have written before. Um, so the romance of it when I first dove into it was like, all right, I'm going to compose you some music and you're going to love it, and that's it. But that's definitely not the case, because just like any creative field, like if you're a graphic designer, an editor, a coder, or whatever, you're a service provider. So the client has the last word because they're paying the bills. So unless you quit the job. Um, what the thing I learned the hard way early on when I started doing this, I was working on Japanese anime, and the most important lesson out of this whole thing I learned was that music sensibilities aren't equal between two people, which I knew, or aligned globally, and that was like a mega problem when I sort of dove into this because I was writing music for Japanese animation, so our parameters of taste aren't the same, and I can compare that to like friends liking music. Like for me, Nine Inch Nails, even like the hardest, like heaviest thing makes me happy. Another friend of mine hates Nine Inch Nails and loves Broadway, and that makes them happy. So our parameters of taste don't align. And the same thing happens with clients. You have to sort of figure out what they're after. And I had a lot of stuff like this happen, where they were like, okay, we need a rock music track for this action sequence. So I'd write them a rock track based on, whatever was popular at the time. And it just kept getting rejected and rejected. So finally I was like, listen, like, what are you looking for? And they're like, well, we want rock music, modern rock music, like Bon Jovi, you know? So again, like you never know what people's tastes are until you really dive deep and, ask what they're after. Um, and then in any cartoon, there's a palette. So is the entire score going to be like jazzy? Is it going to be electronic? Is it going to be orchestral? Is it country? Is it a hybrid of different things? That's part of the initial discussions with directors and producers, and we sort of come up with something that will suit the show. So let's just talk about the composing process, on a schedule. And I won't get too far into this because I want to show you guys some video clips and stuff. But there's a few key things that have to happen. So if you're on a 26 episode season, it's usually in a 2-week cycle. So the first thing we do is we spot the episode. That's where we sit down with the director and all the different audio departments and figure out exactly where the music will go to tell the story. So that's sort of like the blueprint of what I have to do. And I'll just be writing notes frantically on a piece of paper or on my laptop. And it's just what I look at when I need to figure out what I need to do for the week. So I compose it, and then there's like a premix or like a playback screener where the clients watch it for the first time. And for me, that's the scariest moment because they'll either love it or I'll have a lot of revisions to do. So for me, that's always the most nerve-wracking thing. It's episode 1 or 2 where you're just like, oh fuck, like how's this gonna go? We'll find out. And one of the funniest moments for me was on a show a while ago where we switched producers 2 episodes in. So we're on a playback and they were just writing pages and pages of notes. And I'm just sitting there like, oh man, here we go. And at the end of it, they had 4 music notes. And I was like, well, what was all that other stuff? And she was like, oh, that's just the stuff I liked. I've never had that happen before. But anyway, you never know how those are going to go, but it's your job to make the revisions, you address the client comments, and then you have the final mix where everything's packaged up and sent out the door, and I never see the episode again. So that whole process takes about 2 weeks. About 9 days into the first episode, the second episode starts with the same thing. So it's sort of like this rolling freight train, and there's always like an overlap in schedule, and that's where time management is so critical. Yeah, so we have spotting examples here, like cue number 1. It's like, oh, there's our title card from 30 seconds to 35 seconds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk about music cues. A music cue is each individual piece of music that happens in the show. And depending on the complexity of the show or just how busy it might be, there could be 10 things in an episode spanning 25 minutes. There could be 50 pieces, and it's my job to come up with those. Any one of those cues can have any sort of emotion imaginable, all conforming to that sort of sound palette that was defined. So you could have like a melancholy, piano and mallets, or it could be, guitar and whatever. Like it just depends on what the show needs. And then there's different cue usages. So The underscore is the music that helps tell the story, and diegetic is stuff that happens within the character's universe in the show. And sometimes it gets pretty meta. Like sometimes there was one time where I had to score music of a character watching a cartoon within the show. So I'll just show you an example of that now. Here we go. So here's two examples of like stupid pieces of cartoon music within their reality. So here's number one. I was thinking of like really dumb cartoons from like the 80s or 70s or whatever. And then if we sort of watch it,
water forms on the glass, the miracle of condensation begins.
What a documentary!
So that's diegetic music. Then let me just go back to my notes here. So we have different cue types, and there's a whole ton of these. I'm not going to go over them all, but there's some obvious ones like montages you've probably heard, where it just spans like a long passage of time. There's reveals like, oh, I found the treasure. Oh, stings are like quick sort of impact noises. Action is action. Activity is sort of music that just sort of pads the scene to keep things rolling forward instead of getting stale and boring. Marks are marking important informations, or sorry, not informations, are marking important events that happen on screen. And I'll just play a few examples of cue types here. So here's an example of a mark in chiptune. Here's an example of a dangerous reveal. Here's an example of some silly action. And then here's an example of some triumphant fantasy action. Oops, sorry, I hit a key. And then if we watch it in the scene.
The Dimension Robot. Is that it?
Bravest Warriors to battle!
Should we help him?
Sure, why not?
So that was a long sequence where you could hear, those 5 or 6 different pieces flowing along to help tell the story. Just a few more quick examples. So here's some activity music, sort of in a chiptune jazz kind of style. And I purposely used a really bad preset pen.
First, we must gather evidence. Clue friend, look for clues. Aha! Aha! Aha!
So what else do we have? Here's an example of some of the diegetic music. This is music for a restaurant scene, so I had to write some really cheesy kind of music. And then if you hear it within context.
Okay, you were just telling me you think you might possibly be falling for Zach.
Right, I remember.
So it's really
Yeah,
quiet, but it's
you
still
like
there, and I had to
me,
create it because it
but I
exists
just
in their
don't know if
universe.
I-
Another example of a wedding kind of clip. So you can see like the music styles are sort of all over the place, and I have to just do it. So initially you have the musical idea. There's the target market. Is it for, preschool? Is it for tweens? Is it for teens? Is it for adults? Because if I'm writing like a scary piece, you don't want to scare the crap out of little kids, right? Like you have to know what the demographic you're writing for. So good example of that is, here's some anime. So this is some danger. So it's pretty epic and dangerous sounding, right? And that's for like teens and, but here's an example of for 2-year-olds.
Huh? What's that?
So it's like
Well,
it's
out
a
of the
lot
way,
lighter,
please.
right? Like
This
it's for the
bubbly
right
bear needs to
target
get to
audience.
Mr. King's house. I have a play date.
Bye, Bert.
So that's 2-year-old danger. You don't want to scare the crap out of these kids. So, where was I? So you have the composing and production, and the type, the instrument palette, the emotional intent. That's a music cue. So let me just show you an example of a composed section. Sorry, let me show you an example of just a cue here. So I have this scene. It's sort of this play sequence where they want to play cowboys. So
Then how about
I'll
an
watch the
awesome
scene and figure
horse
out
ride? Giddy
where
up,
things
partner.
should shift, and
Yeehaw!
you'll notice there's a lot of action
Ride like
happening,
the breeze, Broomy.
and there's a lot of stop and starting kind of action,
Those sure are some
and then it
helpful
switches
horses.
gears when the parents are talking, and then it jumps back to them playing again. So the music has to cover all these sort of things that are happening. Oh, and nice. So here's the same thing. Here's what I did here. So I'm working in Logic Pro, and I basically have about 1,000 tracks of different instruments, like every kind of sound I think I need for the show. So I can just jump around and pick sounds at random and just write, and that's really important. It's saving me a lot of time. So here's an example of that this cowboy sequence. So every one of these little blobs is a performance that I've played in. So you notice it switched gears there while the parents are talking. Ramps back up for the action. Switches gears again. So that's sort of production, taking these ideas and creating something. Here's another example of that. There was a song in this episode, so I had to write music based around existing dialogue that was in the script. So here's my initial piano sketch that the voice actor recorded to. Uh-oh. Spinny ball. Oh, let's try this again. Well, that is not working. Let me try one more time. Okay, that's not working. I'm going to skip ahead. So my initial, what I came to learn was the negatives of this whole thing is you have to be on even when you're bleeding out the eyes tired. Like your schedule is set. There's no change in the deadlines. I always feel like I never have enough time, especially if there's a ton of music you have to write in the span of a week. I always feel like I never have enough budget. Like I have to be mindful of hiring players. Like, do I need real guitar? Do I need real flute? If I spend all that money, will I have enough money to stay in the green at the end of the show, and pay my bills and stuff? And the hardest one for me initially was like the endless rejection, because, if you write something and the client doesn't like it, they'll just say, oh no, I don't like it, write something else. And I used to take that personally, but I realized it's not a personal attack because they've already hired you for the gig. It's just our sensibilities don't align, and I just have to change my mind and try something else. So that was a really hard one to get a grasp of. But now if the client's like, yeah, I don't like that, I'm like, no problem. And I'll just throw it in the vault and save it for something else. The romance of it is it's harder than I ever thought it would be, because your creative output has to be high all the time. But you end up creating so many things that you never would have made by yourself because you have all these outside variables and influences. I also love that I have to research a ton of music in unfamiliar genres. So now I have all this stuff in my playlist I never would have thought of or found before. Just because a client was like, oh, we need it to sound like this, weird style I once heard while I was on a bus. I also like the freelancer lifestyle. I've done the 9-to-5 thing, the corporate thing, and I prefer working for myself. There's this more flexibility. And of course, it's working on cartoons. So for me, I love it. It's like my favorite thing to do. So I think that's it. I don't know if I'm on time or over, but that's all I got because my Pro Tools is broken.
And you're perfectly on time, Neil. And that was fantastic talk. Wow, thanks so much.
Awesome.
Well, we've got a ton of questions.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, well, look, it's not a contest, but you got more questions than Ken to say.
Uh-oh.
There's a ton. And just because I gave Ken a little jab, uh, I'm gonna give you his question first.
Do it. Let's
So
do it.
Ken says he's not afraid to admit that he's often had his emotions deeply affected by music in a movie or show, and he wonder if that hits you, Neil, or if you've become detached due to it being your day job and you end up being analytical when you watch something.
That's actually a really good question. So I find when I'm working on a show and I'm like sort of knee deep in production, I can't listen to music at all. Like I just can't consume it. So I always end up listening to talk radio. It's the weirdest thing that happens. Movies are different. Like, I mean, I just have an ear for, production mistakes. Like it's just inherent when you hear this kind of stuff. Like you'll be like, oh, there's a mistake there. But no, I still absolutely enjoy movies and games and TV shows. Absolutely. And like when I hear an amazing score, I'm like, man, that score is amazing. But at that point, sometimes I'll just email the composer or find out, their contact info and just reach out and be like, hey, like that was awesome. So I did that with the Queen's Gambit actually, because I was like, man, that score was great. Yeah. So, and it's also when you hear a really good score on television, it's inspiring. It sort of keeps you motivated to do better. So, yeah.
Wow. Yes, great. Cool. So we have some comments. There are actually quite a few comments about your Mac Pro rack. You are at least as famous for that as your cartoons. But you don't need to talk about that. Obviously, you have a massively powerful computer because you need it.
Yeah. And I mean,
Um,
for me, it was just consolidating multiple computer systems because usually the traditional way is, and you'll see this with like Hans Zimmer even, like, you just have secondary satellite computers handling just the orchestra, so it's not putting a stress on your main system. And obviously this put a stress on my system because my Pro Tools goofed out on me. So there you go. It's not immune
uh,
because it's a anyway.
that clip worked in sound check. I just want to let people know. Um, okay. I'm contractually obligated to tell you because Erin Parr is my sweetie. She says Neil's one of my favorite people.
Oh,
So there, that's from co-nerd night boss Erin
does that
Parr.
mean I have to do a Canadianism? Eh?
Well, actually, there's another question. Says he didn't say he's Canadian, but he did say a boot.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah, I forgot to say, yeah, I'm in Toronto, everybody. So Canadian, it's cold. It's still cold. Yeah. I eat cheese, I don't know.
We did that too in the States. So, Neil, without breaking any NDAs, what's the most famous production that you've worked on?
Composing or like just anything?
I'll leave that up to you to answer.
I guess it's a tough one because I mean I'm in Canada, so like not all these shows are like A plus plus or triple A kind of things, but probably the most popular ones are the Japanese animes I did years ago, and they were Bakugan and Beyblade, and those were just all over the world, and they aired all the time. So kids always like reach out. They're like, "Oh man, that's the soundtrack of my childhood," and my heart's all gurgly and stuff. The biggest film I've probably worked on as synth programmer, technical assist for another composer was Rampage with Dwayne Johnson a few years ago. So that was a pretty big feature.
That was big.
We were down in LA recording orchestra and that kind of thing. So that was pretty cool. But yeah, for me, I think my favorite nerd thing I've worked on is Bravest Warriors because it has a solid nerd following. But like the most popular thing was probably the Japanese anime, just because of sheer volume. There were like hundreds of episodes, and they just broadcast everywhere. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Very, very cool. So another question. How often does the music need to be changed after the fact because it then clashes with the sound effects?
Good point. I have to be when I'm writing, especially with action music, um, I'm very aware of what's happening. So if there's like a huge explosion that happens, I'm going to be sure I'm not hitting some big bass energy kind of impact sounds and stuff. I'll write around those things, or if there's like an impact or something like that, I'll either come in late or a hair early. So, the sound effects have their hole. But I mean, this is all stuff that we figure out in the spotting, especially if the sound effect people are there, and our
Mm.
first screener, where we're figuring out what works and what doesn't work. So by the time we do our revisions and we get to the final mix, it's pretty smooth sailing. Like usually by that point, there's no additional changes. So
Okay.
because
Good.
it's just such a fast schedule, like once it's out the door, it's gone. Like it has to go to
Gotcha.
quality
Yeah.
control and it just goes to air. So it's really fast.
So everybody has to work together. You can't just like have the effects people doing their thing and not paying attention to you,
Oh no,
or
no,
vice
it's like,
versa.
well, I mean, and you can hear that sometimes on some shows where you're like, oh man, like I don't know what's wrong here, but like everything just feels like you're being assaulted. There just isn't breathing space, and
Mm.
that's you want like a good audio post supervisor because they're the ones who are going to be like, if the sound effects are doing this crazy thing, maybe you should steer clear of that frequency range in the music just so they're not pouncing on top of each other kind of thing. So
Ah,
it's all about conversation and communicating, just like any kind of product that's made.
gotcha. Gotcha. So, question about tempo. Does the animation generally have a consistent tempo? I assume that means like for a particular show, is there a
Uh,
tempo?
I think it depends. Like on some of the preschool stuff I've worked on, it's very gentle, so I'm not going to be writing like super fast stuff. But when I'm writing music for, something more on the teen side of things, and there's a lot of editing that has to happen between different orchestral things, I tend to write a lot of the action music in the same tempo because then it's easier to edit between them if they're in the same key, and there isn't like this weird shift when you cut between
Mhm.
them because the speed just keeps going and it's consistent. And that country thing I played, that was all at one speed, and the only thing that made it sound like it was slowing up and speeding down was I was going between double time and half time and regular time, and there was still this uniformity to it because it was the same
Ah,
tempo the whole time. Otherwise, you'd be like, it's like stop and go and but you can sort of fake that by just changing, jump to 16th notes instead of eights, or jump to quarters
mhm.
and then up to 16ths, like that kind of the secrets, the tricks.
Huh. That is fascinating. Yeah. So, short answer is yes. You do try to keep the consistent tempo and
Yeah,
use multiples of that
yeah.
to
And I mean,
invoke speed.
yeah, and I mean, obviously, like that's not going to work. Otherwise, the show is just going to sound pretty monotonous. It'll just always be the same. But so,
Mhm.
transitions and bumpers and all those things could be faster or slower. And at the end of the day, it's like
Hmm.
any of this kind of thing. There's no rules. It just whatever the show needs, that's what has to happen. So
Gotcha. Okay. Again, so many questions. I
that's
a
okay.
couple more. I'm just gonna. Here's kind of a big one. It's like a 9-part question.
A nine-part question. Okay.
No, no, it's a 3-part question, but I'm
Okay.
just gonna do part of it that I think is kind of a two-parter.
Okay.
Um, so have you had an experience that you can tell us about where you went out on a limb on a composition and it either it totally backfired and they hated it or they loved it, but tell
I've
us
I've
about that.
had, what, I can just tell you, like I've had both of those things happen.
Uh-huh.
I'll be sitting here and be like, man, this is fucking awesome. And then I'll play it for them and they're like, no, I don't know. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? And you know, again, the client has the last word, but directors are very collaborative, and sometimes I've sort of won those battles. Like I'll just present my case, like we should do this because it's representing the character like this, and this is happening, and it sets us up for this. And sometimes they're like, you know what? That's cool. And otherwise they're like, yeah, but I actually want it like this, and then you have to change it. So, yeah, both ends. And I never get disappointed because chances are I could probably use that piece again somewhere else or use it
Hmm.
as a springboard for another idea. So nothing's ever truly lost. It just sucks when there's like a lot of work to do quickly and I have to deal with that. But yeah, what I do now is like if I'm like, "Oh man, I love this." Like I'll never tell the client that I love it that much. I'll just be
Uh,
like, "Oh yeah, tell me what you think." Just play it coy.
Great, great. Uh, Very good. Um, how much do you like cats?
Is that an Aaron question?
I don't know actually.
I love
I
cats.
have assistants and I'm reading from a compiled list.
Yeah, I'm a cat dad. I have an Asian Bengal. She's so weird, and I feel like she's almost like a cartoon character because she's so erratic and funny and just quirky, and it represents all those things in cartoons I like. And I could turn over to her at any point, although she's not in the studio because it's a separate building. But I could turn over to her at any point, and she'll make me laugh because she's just such a weirdo. So yeah, I like cats. I think it's a given with synthesizers and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I love cats too. I'm just allergic. Can't live with them, but still.
Take drugs.
Uh,
There you go.
yeah. All right. Well, so we multiple questions, and so there's a lot of techie questions here about Logic Pro and templates and Nuendo, and I'm not going to impose those on our broader audience, but we're going to post your. Oh, we did. I'm told we posted your links in
Okay.
the chat, and reach out to Neil and ask him
Yeah,
these
please do.
incredibly detailed questions that I'm sure if you're anything like the rest of us nerds, you'll love to talk about.
Can I mention one thing though about that?
Please do.
That stuff. So templates, I write in templates because it gives me more time to actually write than dealing with tech, and that's really important when you're trying to output a lot of music at the same time. I have my DAW of choice is Logic, but that's only because that's the first thing I use. So if you're using Cubase or Digital Performer or Ableton or whatever, use it. I mean, there's no better DAW than the other. They're all the same in a certain respect, and they all have their amazing things, and they all have the things that drive you crazy. So, I mean, use what you know. I have no
think
preference.
that's probably great advice for everything, to be honest. Oh man, that was really great, and thank you again.